Erev Tov, everyone. When people think of Jewish law, very often what they focus on are some of the big areas like the laws of Shabbat and the holidays, or the laws of what we eat, kashrut, and the laws of prayer. And those are incredibly important. But the beauty of Jewish law is that it's able to function in every moment of our life, not just how we eat, but also how we treat each other. Now, there are some general, big, sweeping ideas about, do what is hateful to you, do not unto your brother, love your neighbor as yourself. Those are beautiful things, but how do you actually act upon that? How do you treat other people? And one of the biggest areas of Jewish law that explores how we interact with each other is the area of Jewish business ethics. In the Guy of the Shulchan Aruch, 16th century, that's the section known as Choshen Mishpat, which actually refers to the chest plate of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, that they would use prophetically to help them make decisions. God would guide the way the stones would fall, etc., in making certain decisions, often business and ethical decisions. So these decisions can be as big as we talked about in a previous business ethics class, investing in a company that sells non-kosher food. Can also do with paying your workers on time, or if I work at a company and taking a couple extra minutes of break because I know my boss won't find out. But again, these topics come up all the time. And in past classes, we've dealt with some more big issues against stocks, which don't really apply to everybody. But tonight, I want to take a kind of deep dive into a topic that probably comes up quite often for all of us. It has at some point, and it likely will again. And the way we're going to do it is we're going to look at four different variations of the same idea. As you can see here, borrowing without permission. And then what we'll do is we'll study the sources, and then we're going to come back. Now, having read the sources and try and answer the questions, I'll turn it back to the class on which of these might be, how would we rule in these cases? So rather than start out and saying, how would you rule on it now? I just want to go through them, do the sources, and then with the information in your head, I'll open it up, I'll unmute everybody and invite people to tell me what they think is permitted or not permitted in these cases. So again, the general topic is to borrow something without someone's permission. One of the rabbis below, I don't remember if I saw it, will say explicitly, if I go up and say, Tamar, may I borrow a chair from your house? And you say yes, that's not the issue here. 99% of these cases are with a lack of communication. There wasn't a clear contract. We didn't discuss the deal that we were going to do. I did something without checking with a person. That's where these cases come up. When there's clear communication, not really an issue. So if I ask to borrow something and someone says yes, not a problem. Now they can lie later, and that's another thing. But this is, well, let's look at the cases. If I go over to somebody's house, I'm hanging out waiting for my friend, and they have a bowl of pretzels sitting out on the kitchen counter. Can I take a couple and eat a couple with the bracha, of course, with the blessing, without asking for permission? If I said, of course, to the parents, may I have some pretzels? Not an issue. But can I eat some without asking? And again, I'm not going into their pantry. I'm being very specific here. This is a bowl sitting on the counter. The second case here is let's say high schoolers. Again, you have to imagine when this would come up. Some high schoolers want to play a basketball game. They can't find a ball, and they know that their friend just got a new basketball. He keeps in his locker, and he keeps his locker unlocked. Can I go into the locker, or can a high schooler go into the locker, take the basketball out, play a game, and put it back? And in the back of our heads, we might be thinking, oh, what if you destroy the ball, pop the ball? We can mention that, but let's say that I put the ball back and it's basically it is in the same condition. My friend wouldn't even find out unless I tell him. And I'm being clear about that because I want to simplify the cases. The third one is now getting specific within the realm of synagogue or a yeshiva, a Jewish school. And this actually does come up in shul. Let's say somebody comes to a shul, and on the front safsal, the front bench, is where I keep my talit gadol, my big talis. Can somebody come, a guest, and let's say they know it's my talis, or they don't even know and they just assume that it's somebody's, but they want to use it. Can someone just pick up and use my talis? What about on a weekday? I have my tefillin there. Or someone leaves their tefillin. They're not there on a Sunday morning minyan, and someone needs a pair. Can I say, oh, you can borrow this person's? Is that permitted? And then the last one is also somewhat related, is let's say again that I have a book in shul, or someone has a book in shul that they're learning. Someone sits down, that person isn't there. Again, if I ask, oh, can I read that book you're reading? Fine. But can I pick up someone's book that I know is theirs? They brought from home. Their name is on the cover. Can someone pick it up and start perusing it? Those are the four cases. And now what we'll do is look at the sources, and then we'll go back and see what we think the answers would be to these four questions. So Tamar, I'm going to unmute you for the first source. And the first question that the rabbis start to explore, it actually begins in the Mishnah and then is explored in the Talmud, is the idea of borrowing, meaning this is the important distinction. Borrowing means you're giving it back. If I'm taking something without permission, that's called stealing. But if I'm in a movie, sometimes, they steal a car and they say, oh, I'm just borrowing it, and they smash it into a million bits to save the world. That's not what we're talking about. Someone actually is borrowing it. They take good care of it and they return it in fine, pristine condition. The only changes are at the molecular level. Is it permitted? Is borrowing, assumed to just be totally fine if I'm going to give it back? Tamar, bevakasha.
Mishnah. One who sends his young under bar mitzvah son to a store, the father places the
Pundion. It's a coin. Yeah.
Was 2 isar in his son's hand and asks him to buy 1 isar's worth of oil and to bring back the oil together with 1 isar change.
So he gives him a $5 bill and it costs $2.50. Sorry, it was a $5 bill, $2.50 for a bottle of oil. So he says, come back with a bottle of oil and $2.50 in change. That's the other translation. Sorry, bevakasha. He also
gives the son a bottle to fill with the oil. The store owner measures out an isar's worth of oil. The store owner gives the child the isar of oil, and the child breaks the bottle of oil and loses the isar change. The store owner is liable for the damage of the bottle and loss of the oil and the isar change. Rabbi Yehuda absolves the store owner for the damage to this bottle, as will be explained in the Gemara. He also absolves the store owner for the loss of the oil and money, because the father willingly took the risk of sending them with a child.
So the important thing is going to be source 2 that tomorrow I'll have you take as well, with the basic stories. Again, the father sent his little kid to the store who, doesn't really have full culpability. But because the father took the risk of sending it with his underage son, any damage that happens to it while the son has it is the son's responsibility and not the store owner's. But again, what we care about is in source number 2, which is a little bit later on the page in the Gemara. So bevakasha Tamar, said Rava.
Said Rava, I and the lion, leader of the group, explained this Mishnah. Who is the lion of the group? Rabbi Zeira. This Mishnah is dealing with the case where the store owner took the bottle the boy had brought from home and used it for measuring for his other clients. The dispute in our Mishnah is about the status of one who borrows without permission. One opinion, Rabbi Yehuda's, is that he has the status of a normal borrower. The other, the sages, hold that he has the status of a thief.
Excellent, thank you. So what's happening here is, in this story, a little kid takes it to the store, and the little kid breaks it and loses everything. So, but then there's opinion that says that the store owner is responsible for this. And what did he do wrong? And then Rabbi Yehuda says he didn't do anything wrong. So what the Gemara says is there's a background to the story. That the kid goes into the store and says, can I have a bottle of oil? And the store owner says, yes, but I'm going to borrow your bottle of oil to help this other customer, to help mixing and stuff like that. And while he's doing that, he breaks that. So the rabbis say he is liable because he had no permission to borrow the bottle. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says borrowing is fine. So in the end, as we'll see in a moment, and this next commentary from the 18th century kind of clarifies it about what the issue is at hand. But essentially, that's what the rabbis say is the debate here. Because if you read the story, then you just say, why would the store owner ever be in trouble? He did nothing wrong. It's all the little boy. But if you create this backstory that the owner borrowed it and used it before giving it back to the boy before it broke, then you say, oh, that makes more sense. So they totally change whatever the story was about to a new conversation about, am I allowed to borrow, which really means use someone's property without their permission, because that's what all these cases are about. This is a better way of saying, instead of saying borrowing, can I use somebody's property without their permission? And again, we're putting aside the case of if I damage it, I am definitely responsible for the damage. That goes without saying. So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this next source, which is one that we really haven't seen, but it's an excellent commentary on topics in the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch, and he just kind of clarifies the issue at hand. Rabbi Yehuda Heller Kahana, please. Gloria.
The understanding of the argument over whether one who borrows the bottle without permission is considered a thief or not is contingent on whether one who merely steals the use of an object is considered a thief or not.
Excellent. This is a very important distinction that comes up in a lot of places in the really deep thinking. They call it a lumdisha question from the word lamad, learning, which is I'm not taking the object permanently. So I'm not taking anything away. What am I taking? I'm taking use of the object. Do I have permission to, again, I don't have permission to take the object for myself, but do I have permission to get use out of it? So he's making a distinction there because let's say the store owner didn't break the bottle, which again is why that story from the Mishnah, it doesn't seem like the best example. It's the rabbis are almost using it as a vehicle for their conversation about borrowing and theft. But the Trumat Hakri's point here is, if he hadn't broken the bottle, would there have been a problem? So again, we'll see. I'll have you read that. In fact, Gloria, why don't you just read that very, very short source number 4 from the Shulchan Aruch? What's the ruling on this? And this is the ruling that everyone agrees with, the base ruling, please.
Even one who borrows without the consent of the owner is called a thief.
We ended our class right now, we'd say that's it, which is that borrowing without permission or using, again, it's better to say using someone's property. The Trumat Hakri makes that important distinction. This is where I will absolutely give it back. I will not damage it in any way. Am I allowed to use someone's talis? Am I allowed to use someone's basketball? I'm allowed to, eating the food might seem like a slight different variation because they're not going to get that food back. They don't want it back at that point. But using somebody else's thing without permission, the fundamental ruling is that it is forbidden. Well, even though there's a debate in the Talmud, Rabbi Yehuda, one voice, says it's fine. The Chachamim, the sages in general, disagree and say that it is theft. So before we go on to the next section, are there any exceptions? Any questions up until now? All right, beautiful, excellent. So like I said, if we just, it just says borrowing is stealing, so that would be the end of our class, except as with all things, there are terutzim, there are exceptions to this. So Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And we're actually jumping around in history a little bit. Yeah, we're not totally in chronological order, but these are 3 different exceptions that are accepted across the board. Even though chronologically these are slightly out of order, these represent the 3 exceptions to when borrowing would be permitted. So this first source is a Tosefta, which means that in the 2nd century, actually the 3rd century, in 220 CE or around there, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi saw that there were dozens of compilations of rabbinic laws and rulings, and he narrowed it down into one famous one we call the Mishnah. What about all the other ones that didn't make it in? There was another very popular compilation, and that was called the Tosefta. And in fact, if you can still get a copy of it. And what's cool is you'll look at the Mishnah and the Tosefta, and you'll say, wow, they're super similar. But there's a lot more stuff in the Tosefta. And it was edited out sometimes on purpose, whatever it is like that. But the Tosefta is basically contemporaneous and close in authority to the Mishnah. So go ahead, please, Jane, source number 1.
A son who was eating of his father's food, and similarly a servant who was eating of his master's, can give a portion to the son, daughter, or servant of his father's or master's friend. He need not worry about theft from the owner, because this was the common custom.
Yeah, I mean, and you can already see how this would apply to one of our cases about, if there's a bowl of pretzels that's meant for guests to eat, and that's, let's say, in Milwaukee. Again, I don't know if this is true. I don't think it's true. But let's say that in Milwaukee, there's a custom that everybody puts out a bowl of cheese curds. And it's known that when you come in at someone's house, that like everyone's expected that it's okay to do cheese curds. Maybe a bowl of jelly beans or M&Ms. But like there's a city where everybody knows you put out a bowl of candy for guests, and guests can take as many as they want. Like, lollipops at a doctor's office, et cetera, like that. It's okay to take it, or stickers. Or here's another one at a store where they have business cards or stickers advertising it. I usually ask, is it okay if I take a sticker? And they always look at me, not like I'm an idiot, but they're like, of course it is, because that's the common custom. So if there's a case where there's something where it's either taken or either taking it, borrowing it, using it, everybody just does it. And the question is, what are specific examples of that? A bowl of apples, sitting on the counter. If it's known that the widespread custom that it's okay to take or use something like that, then it's fine. Let's say you go to a tennis court and there's always extra tennis balls caught in the bushes and stuff like that. I don't actually know if there's an official custom, but I imagine most people who lose their tennis balls in the bushes are fine if somebody finds it and takes it. Now, there's other Jewish laws about lost property that would apply here, but let's say that there's a tennis court where everybody just kind of leaves a couple balls and everyone knows it's okay to use them and just leave some behind. If that's the accepted custom, then that would not be considered theft. That would be considered permissive borrowing. So that's probably a better example, like, a court where everybody just leaves the tennis balls that they're done with for the next player to use. So we'll come back to that, but that's the first exception is if everybody's okay with it and they're like, no, a bowl of apples is fine. Again, this wouldn't apply in every kind of situation, but it's an important exception. So any questions on that first one to clarify it or where it might come up? Because there's just 3 of them, so I want to make sure we get each one well. Any questions on that? Beautiful. Jane, I'll have you take one more before we move on. So the second one is there are 2 incredibly main important commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. There are many other ones, but the 2 biggest ones are the Turei Zahav, the Taz, and the Shach, the Shabtai Kohen or Siftei Kohen is the nickname for it, 17th century Lithuania. And on the section on ethics, etc., Choshen Mishpat, this is the second exception that we have here, please.
If I would not fear, I would say that it is permitted. He knows that the owner will consent, and therefore now, too, it comes into his hands with permission, for we can assume that he is not particular about this.
Excellent. So the Hebrew is really beautiful. Ve'ilav de mistefina. If I wasn't hesitant about this, nervous about this, and a lot of rabbis will say that as they know what the ruling should be. They have a gut feeling, or it just makes sense that the ruling should be in some way, but they want to say, like, you'll hear me say this when I get into very sensitive, controversial topics. I might say, it seems to me that it should be this way, but I've literally said in classes, I want to be careful about how I'm saying this and conscious of it, because it's not necessarily the popular view. Now this is popular and accepted everywhere, even though which is, if I go into someone's house and I want to borrow somebody's record, that's a great example. Someone who has an amazing record collection, and everybody knows that he is totally cool with people borrowing his records as long as they're careful and give them back. Or a guy who has a library that loves when people borrow his books and it knows it's fine, again, as long as you give them back. But this is the key. You don't have to ask this person for permission, but you have to know this person. So if I go to someone's house and I'm like, I'm just going to borrow their cat for a week, that's theft. But like, if I go into someone's house and I know that my friend Lewis is super cool with me borrowing his skateboard, which I've never done and I would fall off immediately. But if I know that my friend is 100% okay with that because I know him as a person or her as a person, then it's fine. So this in some ways is more limited, but it could also be very broad because it can apply to using a lot more things. Somebody has an amazing costume collection and I need something for a play with, a youth group, and they're not around, but I know that they love and they're fine with people borrowing it as long as they're careful, clean it, and give it back. Then it's fine.
But it doesn't allow for you to leave a note or something. I mean, I think the idea of just taking something, whether you know the person or not, just taking it doesn't seem right to me.
So I totally validate that, but here we're talking about, there's 2 sides to this. There's courtesy, and then there's what's permitted. Now, the reality is in our day and age, certainly you could leave a note. The rabbis would never say you can't leave a note, so the person comes back and knows where it is, but leaving a note doesn't make it any more permitted. But today, with texting and stuff like that, some of these cases wouldn't be quite as relevant. But let's say it's on Shabbat, and that's where we'll get to, go back to our cases about using a talit and shul and stuff like that. But your discomfort is very important experientially, but if you're in a pinch, and you're like, I don't want to do this, I'd rather ask him, but you need the thing, and you know that the person is okay with it, then you could say, I rely upon this. But again, just because something is permitted doesn't mean we have to do it. It doesn't necessarily mean we always should do it. But again, this is really talking about somebody who's really just doesn't care. They're super cool about it. And your discomfort, Jane, if you had a friend, if you come over to my house and there's a book that you really want to, you're sitting waiting for lunch and you want to take a book off my shelf, I'm giving you explicit permission to do that. I love when people read the books in my house. But like, let's say you just like, you assume that you're like, the rabbi, as long as I don't take it out of the house, I'm sure the rabbi's fine with it. But if you know me and I'm really chill about that, you wouldn't have that hesitation. The hesitation you're having might be because you're thinking about not this specific friend. Let's think about a son. If I don't know if Jeremy takes things from your house, but when I go to my mom's house, if I walk into her room and just take something to use, I know she doesn't care because she loves me, she trusts me, etc., like that. So for me, there'd be no hesitation because it's my mom or my sister or my kids, etc., like that. So in your head, try and get to a situation where you're like, oh, you know what? I do have a friend where I know they'd be totally fine if I borrowed it, if I was careful and gave it back. But I very much hear what you're saying. So the last one here, I'll take this one. Now we're going back in time to the Rosh, Asher ben Yechiel, who's such a brilliant and fascinating character. He was expelled from the Ashkenazi lands. He was an Ashkenazi rabbi, but then he moved to Spain. And his influence went both ways, in that some of his rulings were influenced by Sephardic Spanish ones, but his rulings also influenced the Sephardic culture because his learning was so great that even the Sephardim respected him. So I don't remember specific examples now, but there are like some big laws where, again, he changed or he convinced the Sephardim to change. So he's an incredibly important figure for the Shulchan Aruch, for the Mishnah Torah. Like, he's one of the big three of ancient. When the Shulchan Aruch was figuring out his three sources, Rosh was one of the three, which is funny because even though he's Ashkenazi, he was kind of Sephardi at the same time. But his example here is the custom became v'nahagu, which means like this is just what people started doing, became to allow a person to use a friend's talit even without his prior knowledge and to make a blessing over it. Because you wouldn't generally not make a blessing over a mitzvah of something that you've stolen, like a stolen lulav. They relied on the principle a person is comfortable with and will give consent to having a mitzvah performed with his money. If he found it folded when he returns it, he should leave it folded as before, for otherwise people are not happy with others using their talit. So again, this is that as long as I take care of it and leave it in the same condition. But again, the principle here is that if I am let's say that I walk into my friend's house and I'm watching their house and someone comes to the door and they're asking for money and they're legitimate. I know that they're, above reproach. Can I take money out of my friend's tzedakah box? And this would presume that yes. If I said, oh, I use some of your tzedakah money to help a poor person, we can assume that most people would be okay with that. Now, all of you might be thinking, well, I know somebody who wouldn't like that. But the ruling here is that because it's the widespread custom, again, going back to source number one, the Tosefta, because we can assume that most people would be happy to know that their objects are being used specifically for a mitzvah. We're not talking about a basketball in this case. We're talking about a talit for a mitzvah, tefillin for a mitzvah, tzedakah for a mitzvah, etc., like that. Then it would be permitted. And again, the key here is these exceptions mean not only it would be permitted, it cannot be called theft. So if my friend was angry and said, how dare you have used my talit? Again, I did nothing to it. I left it folded. Someone mentioned it to him. Oh, did you know Joel used your talis on Shabbos? I'm taking him to court and suing him as a thief. He would lose because of this Rosh and everyone who agrees with him. So any questions now on the third exception? Beautiful. So again, the first and third have a lot of connection, which is if it's everybody knows it's totally fine to do this, it's an accepted custom to do X, then it's fine. That's one. Two, if we know the person and we know that they'd be fine with it, it's fine. It's not theft. And the third one is specifically if I'm using whatever the object is for the sake of fulfilling a mitzvah. And the assumption is that even if we don't know that person so well, that's the key difference with number two. We don't need to know the person. Again, I, Rabbi Dinan, would jump up and down with joy if I heard that while I'm away for Shabbos, we didn't have enough talitot, and they thought, I hope it was okay, but we let somebody use your talis when they read Torah. I would say, I love you, thank you for doing that. But even if I didn't, and I said, how dare you, I'd be in the wrong. That's the third exception. But I'm saying here it's fine. You can use my talis. Just don't get it mixed up. There's a secret I have on it, how I know it's always mine, although I'm taking it to Israel. There's just a quick thing in the chat. They are not labeled. So the ones that belong to the synagogue, Anne's question is about, are they labeled? If they're communal property, then it's not an issue. It's not, they're meant for general use. I think some of these cases are imagining more a Beit Midrash or yeshiva, where each student has a specific spot where they have their own set books, their own tefillin, their own talit, and a guest from the community comes in and the student isn't there and they didn't bring their tefillin, can they use that student's tefillin? And this third source would imply yes. So before we go on to the last section and then loop back to the beginning cases, which I think we're getting a sense of how to rule on them, any questions up until now? Beautiful. So this last section is really interesting because it's not based on what we've read. You would say, oh, I didn't expect it to go this way. And this is specifically about borrowing books. Now, again, the mind or the place that the rabbis are in when they're thinking about these cases are probably, again, going into a shul. They're not, worrying about somebody borrowing someone's copy of the Da Vinci Codes. It's really talking about borrowing someone's copy of the Mishnah or their commentary on the Torah. There's Rashi commentary, or picking up a Siddur Machzor. Again, we're not talking about a synagogue copies that are for everyone. There's a copy I have on the High Holidays that has a little post-it that says Rabbi's copy. If I'm not there, can someone pick up the rabbi's copy and daven from it? So there's two different sources on here. So Tamar, I'll have you take the one from the Shulchan Aruch, please.
Okay, but it is prohibited to learn from his friend's book without his prior consent. So people are worried that he might tear them during learning.
So now this is one of those interesting things where the Shulchan Aruch says one thing, and then Tamar, you were asking about this before class. What about if people just don't listen to it? They don't listen to what's in the Shulchan Aruch and they do something different. What do? Well, we have in the 19th century Aruch HaShulchan, which is the name of the Shulchan Aruch backwards, who comes along and justifies and defends what the people do. So the Shulchan Aruch says that with the case of tefillin, which are, this is why I call it tefillin meitaf, tefillin generally do not fall apart from one use. A talit is not going to rip from one use. If it does, you're responsible for it. But those are objects that if you use them once, a guest uses it without permission, it'll be fine. Things like a basketball generally are not going to break from playing one game. They might not even get scuffed after one game. But books, again, generally, they don't get ruined that way, but they're more sensitive. They might get crinkled or torn or anything like that. But again, the Shulchan Aruch says books are a little bit more delicate. Don't touch someone's books. But people did it anyways. And I've seen it all the time. People come into yeshivas and they go over to someone's spot and they just take a book off of someone's little area and just start perusing through it. How could that be okay? So Tamar, I'll let you go ahead and take the justification from the Aruch HaShulchan, please.
Nevertheless, merely looking through a book is treated as permissible. Similarly, using a siddur or a machzor without the owner's explicit consent is treated as permissible because most people are not particular about this.
Excellent. So it's interesting. The Hebrew, he says, mikol makom. In any case, le'ayin ba'alma. So just like looking, just seeing, in general. So what does that mean? So the one thing that would be clear, if I literally open it up and I'm just curious about it's Shabbat, I'm in shul, it's the first verse of the Torah, Bereshit, and I'm curious what Rashi has to say on it. There's a commentary of Rashi, I take the book off, turn to page 1, look, okay, nice, put it back. So that's the Aruch HaShulchan is definitely defending that. But what if, again, I want to use a Siddur, and it says Jane's Siddur, and Jane's not there on Shabbat, would it be okay for me to pray with it? Now that praying is not just la'ayin ba'alma, not just a general look. I'm going to be praying from that Siddur or Machzor for potentially a couple of hours. So why is the Aruch HaShulchan saying that's permitted? And perhaps the distinction for him, la'ayin ba'alma, may not just mean, oh, let me look for 2 seconds and put it back. I just want to say one blessing and put it back. It's just like, I'm just using it a little bit while I'm there, as opposed to taking the book home, borrowing it, studying it, poring over it for hours. Now, again, the Shulchan Aruch does not make that distinction. The Aruch HaShulchan comes back and, again, defends the people because, again, many people are protective of their books. I've invested a lot of my books over the years. I love when people borrow them, but I don't want them to be ruined. I want to get them back. I think I have one book that's floating out there that I still haven't gotten back. So I care about my books. But in general, do we assume that most people are fine if somebody just takes a book off a shelf for a little bit? And whether or not that's true, the Aruch HaShulchan is trying to defend that practice and says, people are fine if you use it a little bit. If you take it home, you keep it for 3 months, then maybe it's a problem. And what he would say is that's what the Shulchan Aruch is writing about. It doesn't seem to be that's what the Shulchan Aruch is writing about. He seems pretty clear that don't borrow people's books without permission. But again, people do it anyways. So the compromise understanding is using it for a temporary basis in shul, quick checking, a quick davening, fine, but don't borrow it or learn seriously from it. So that's just also an insight into the development of Jewish law and how we justify when practices change. But now that we've seen the 3 important exceptions, and even specifically about books, where it says it's not okay, there's no exception by books, except there is, now we can go back to original cases. So what I'm going to do is, let's see if I can do this easily. I will invite anyone who wishes to unmute, and then let's go case by case and just throw up your hand or call out when you think you know the answer. So the first one, visiting your friend's house and eating his parents' food. Again, I'm not going into the cupboard, making myself a sandwich or a bowl of cereal, but there's some apples. There's a bowl of apples on the counter. Can I have an apple? Who wants to venture a guess?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Excellent. And I think yes. And again, the reason is because that's generally what people do. Now, again, does that mean we need, and this is an important thing in Jewish law, we do not need to go to every person in the world and ask them if they're okay with it. It matters what the general custom is. So if we find the one person who's the exception to the rule and says, how dare you, you have to sign out for those apples, I'm suing you, they would lose the case. And they're not a nice person and they're crazy. But yeah, eating food that's put out like a bowl of candy, again, that's also very common, that would be fine. Now, going back to Jane's original comment, would it still be nice to ask their permission? Of course it would. You don't necessarily have to. And I think personally, experientially, there's a difference between taking an M&M versus taking a whole apple. But is it permitted in both cases? Yes.
Yes.
Now, the second question, again, and this could be a high school, this could be at a gym, it could be at a million different places, and you can insert anything here, borrowing someone's bike, borrowing, whatever it is, but this specific case. Can I borrow my friend's basketball? We want to play, just a game of basketball without asking his permission.
So in this case, I think it depends on the relationship.
Yes. So I think there's 2 things here. Now, I don't play basketball enough. We could ask our former treasurer, Steve, about if it's the common custom that everybody's cool with whoever has a basketball, take it. But I assume people are generally protective. They bring their own basketball. So what would be the factor we'd need to know to answer this question, Jane?
If this is your close personal friend who wouldn't mind, but if it's someone, on the team who, the only way you know him is because you play basketball with him, you wouldn't necessarily take his basketball.
Excellent. And now, again, if there was a gym or in town, people knew that people leave their basketballs. They even write their name on Sharpie, but it's understood that if they're not there, everybody's generally okay with you borrowing it even without permission. That would be an exception you could rely on. But I think in this case, again, I don't think that's the custom, but in this case, if your friend is cool with it, he said something implied, or he's just a really chill, a woman or man or woman, then it would be okay. So this case is it depends. The third case, again, going into a shul or yeshiva, and you forgot your talit or tefillin and you want to wear it, can you wear someone else's talit or tefillin without permission? Survey says?
Well, it's a mitzvah, so probably yes.
Yep. Because we assume that most people, and again, in Jewish law, we go by the majority of people, not the exception to the rule. And most people, we hope, would be overjoyed that you would use a mitzvah. And again, there's a source that I didn't bring here that I mentioned a few times. Again, if somebody who's borrowing it damages it in a way that they, that was in their control, not like an elephant ran over them, then they would be responsible for fixing it. But if they return the talit, we saw that explicitly. You borrow a talit that was folded, you must return it folded. You borrow tefillin that are in their case, put them back in their case, in their bag, etc. Yeah, Tamar, do you have your hand up?
I have a question.
Please, bevakasha.
That's for the same purpose, for fulfilling a mitzvah, you are not allowed to borrow a friend's lulav and etrog.
And do you know why that's a different case? What's the difference between lulav as opposed to just a pair of tefillin?
I don't know.
There's a pasuk, so you would be able to do it with a borrowed one on the Chol HaMoed days of Sukkot in the last days. So the reason is
only if the owner gives it to you.
That's only applies on the first days because the pasuk in the Torah, I don't remember the exact language, says take for yourself. Well, that is the exact language, which the rabbis understand to mean that it on the first days of the holiday, which again it would really be the first day in Israel, but the first 2 days in outside of Israel, it must belong to you. It cannot be a borrowed one. So there's this trick of you can't borrow it; it has to be given to you. Almanat that you're going to return it on condition you're going to return it. So that's a specific thing having to do with the mitzvah of lulav, that it has to belong to the person who is doing it. Whereas in the intermediate days, it doesn't apply. So a borrowed lulav would be totally fine. But that's an excellent question to kind of prove the case here. It would be fine to fulfill the mitzvah with a lulav during Chol HaMoed, the intermediate days and the last days. The first one's no, not because borrowing is not permitted, but because that mitzvah is something special where it has to belong to the person. And again, there are ways to get around. So that was a really excellent question because it was a great example of applying the principle. So for number 3, yes, not as long as one can borrow something for a mitzvah, with the exception of a lulav on the first days. And then the last one here, again, I don't know if the rabbis really were talking about borrowing someone's copy of, a popular book or something like that, but going into shul and seeing rabbi's copy of the Siddur and the rabbi's not there, can someone daven from that? And survey says,
yes.
Yes. Now, if you had just gone by the Shulchan Aruch, then the answer would be
No.
no. But the popular widespread custom, at least among Ashkenazim, I actually would have to look deeper to find out if Sephardim rule differently, because as we mentioned, I think in either in shul or another class, that Sephardim typically go by the Shulchan Aruch explicitly and not the Ashkenazi rulings. But for Ashkenazi Jews, Eastern European, etc. Jews, it would be permitted to use the book in that limited temporary fashion, as long as, again, one is careful and respectful of it. So now we've been able to see the principles and apply them to real world cases. And if you, after this class, maybe you'll come up with something, you'll say, oh, I actually have never thought about applying this here before. So